A black screen, wind, distant waves, and the faint thrum of a highway. No face appears, just a voice, calm, cold, and close. Along a ribbon of quiet road that links America's oldest towns, something terrible slipped between the trees. It left behind cars, couples, and a question the trees still refuse to answer. Colonial Parkway Murders, 1986 to 1989. The Parkway at night. The Colonial Parkway curves through the low country of Southeast Virginia, a place where history rests and tourists slow down to drink it in. In the mid-1980s, it was also a place couples pulled over for a private moment. Motorists stopped to check a flat tire. Friends who trusted one another parked to trade a cigarette. Slow drone over tree-lined parkway at dusk. A vintage 1980s sedan turning onto a shoulder, headlights cutting through mist. Between 1986 and 1989, that ordinary privacy became a hunting ground. For seemingly separate incidents would produce 8 victims. Lives interrupted in the country's hush. The pattern did not announce itself at once. It took months for investigators to see a line connecting the scattered tragedies. The discoveries, the victims were found in woods, marshes, and along secluded access roads. They were ordinary people, partners, lovers, friends, whose evenings ended without explanation. Each discovery sent ripples through the towns they left behind. Police tape fluttering, slow pans across evidence markers, anonymous Polaroid photos of parked cars from the 1980s, no faces. For those first responders, the scenes were confusing. Cars stopped on the shoulder, abandoned possessions. Sometimes the bodies were close to the vehicles. Sometimes they were miles away. The geography suggested knowledge. Someone who knew the parkway, its turnoffs, its back roads. How do you hide people from a place that remembers every car that passes? The investigation, multiple agencies, one file. Local police, county detectives, state troopers, and federal agents all touched the case. The investigators compared notes, but jurisdictional lines and different paperwork slowed the thread of the investigation. In the pre-digital era, records sat in boxes and telephone logs were paper. Time and transferability were enemies. Stacks of manila folders, a detective pinning blue string between photos on a corkboard, slow close-ups of stamped case files. Investigators searched for a pattern. Was it a single killer working methodically, or multiple offenders exploiting the parkway's cover? Victimology suggested vulnerability rather than fame. Couples out at night, sometimes sex workers, sometimes students or travelers. Yet motive, robbery, rage, sexual violence, or something darker, remained contested. Leads, persons of interest, and public panic. Over the years, tips poured in: suspicious cars, men seen at odd hours, confessions that collapsed under questioning. People who once seemed peripheral became persons of interest. Others were ruled out. The public turned frantic, and with panic came rumor. TV news clippings, grainy eyewitness sketches, library microfiche of newspaper headlines. Twist. A few leads looked promising. A vehicle description matched multiple witnesses. A local man's odd behavior drew scrutiny, but no single piece of evidence tied every attack together. In a case that threaded multiple counties, an inconsistent alibi could be damning, but only if the evidence could hold up in court. Forensics, failures, and new tools. Forensic science in the late 1980s had limits. Fingerprints and witness testimony were core. DNA testing was embryonic. Evidence collected then would later be rerun with modern methods. Cold cases often hinge on a preserved hair, a thread, the grit under a nail. Lab techs at work, a vial labeled and sealed in an evidence locker, a modern technician in a gene genealogy lab staring at a screen. Years later, investigators reopened files and reanalyzed evidence using DNA and forensic genealogy. Those methods have solved cold cases nationwide, but they don't always produce tidy answers, and contamination or loss of early evidence can close doors forever. Theories that refuse to die. Theories about the Parkway murders spread like shoreline fog. Some argued for a lone, mobile killer who knew the terrain and timed his stops. Others believed in opportunistic attacks by different perpetrators, all preying on the same vulnerability. A darker theory suggested someone with local access, perhaps working in a job that moved between counties. Online sleuths and armchair detectives assembled timelines and mapped last known locations. They proposed suspects, dates, and motives. But every time a theory seemed airtight, the case produced a wrenching flaw. An alibi that checked out, an eyewitness who admitted to mistakes, or evidence that refused to link people together. The human cost. Behind the forensic files are grieving families who still light candles. Children grew up without answers. Partners lived with suspicion and pain. The victims' names, their birthdays, favorite songs, the way they smiled when nervous, belong to people, not mysteries. Treating them as anything else risks flattening real loss into entertainment. A faded Polaroid on a mantle, a small roadside memorial, hands clasped around a photograph. The most compelling twist, two competing endings. As the years passed, two endings formed for the Parkway, neither definitive, both plausible. One, the single, methodical killer. This reading says one offender stalked the road for years. Patient, mobile, intimately familiar with the area's cut-throughs. He knew how far he could drive in darkness and where his actions wouldn't be easily observed. The geography of the dump sites suggested confidence, maybe local knowledge. Two, multiple opportunists. The alternative argues that the Colonial Parkway offered prime opportunities over time for different predators. The victims shared vulnerability, but not necessarily a common enemy. This reading fits the occasional differences in evidence and the lack of a single smoking gun. If one killer existed, he may still be alive. If multiple attackers acted, some may never face justice. Either conclusion leaves families suspended between grief and unanswered questions. Why this case still matters. Cold cases are not museum pieces. They are active wounds that demand attention. Advances in DNA, renewed media interest, and tenacious detectives can change outcomes. The Colonial Parkway murders remain a cautionary story about jurisdiction, about how a stretch of road can be both scenic and dangerous, and about how small procedural choices can echo for decades. Modern investigators opening an evidence locker, a genealogy tree on screen, a sunrise over the Parkway. The invitation. The Parkway remembers more than we give it credit for. If you drove those roads in the late 80s and remember a face, a license plate, or an odd exchange, tell someone. If you're watching from knowledge-sparse distance, share the story respectfully. Keeping the light on cold cases matters, not for thrills, but because someone's daughter, brother, or friend still waits for an answer. A slow pull away from a lonely turnout on Colonial Parkway as fog rolls in. The engine of a distant car dies. Silence fills the screen. 8 lives. For attacks. Years of questions. The road keeps its secrets. But secrets slip when enough people keep looking.